Hey, good morning. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Command Sergeant Major Bradford, and I'm going to speak to you all today in reference to effective writing for evaluations. And then we're also going to move into the centralized NCO board process and what that means and how these two topics blend into each other. So I'd like you to sit back, relax, think of some questions that you may have because effective writing, effective communication, and how we're moving as a non-commissioned officer corps in selecting our NCOs through the new evaluation process, board process, is critically important to understand. So with that, sit back and let's begin the training. Climb to glory. We're going to go ahead and begin with the effective writing for evaluations. So one of the things that we need to start off first as we discuss the evaluation process and understanding how to effectively write on our evaluations is understanding the role between the rater and the senior rater. At the end of the day, the senior rater is the owner of the evaluation, and they are responsible for its timely completion. You have to mentor, develop, and counsel your subordinates. This is at the rater level and also at the senior rater level. The regulation clearly states that and suggests that a senior rater should counsel, provide feedback at least twice during that rating period. And how do we do that? Well, we do that by using the support form, which is a tool that's available to aid and guide and to lay out goals and objectives throughout the rating period. And that support form is something that the individual soldier should be a part of the process. The soldier should be laying out their goals and expectations that they plan to achieve during that rated period as well. And as a rater and senior rater, you need to have a basic understanding of how the evaluation system works. It has to be accurate to assess the subordinates. And again, like I was just saying a minute ago, the subordinates have a role in participating in the counseling. The senior rater narratives are absolutely crucial, and that's really what we're going to hone in on today in reference to effective writing is the difference between exclusive and strong narratives, and those should be incorporated to define the non-commissioned officer or the individual that you're rating. It has to be you are telling a board whether they should select or whether they shouldn't select. And the board process favors very heavily upon those comments, those written assessments that are articulated by the senior rater. So you have to be careful. You have to be careful because what you say is just as damaging as what you don't say. You have to quantify your potential. You have to identify the best. The evaluation system that we had used for 30 some odd years prior to this, it was an inflated system. And we've moved to a very constrained profile system, which requires the senior rater to truly identify the best of the best. So the days of saying him or her do good job, those are over. The senior rater has to understand how to write and how to articulate what is being achieved and what is not being achieved. As an individual soldier, you need to understand your senior rater's profile. You need to understand, what is their philosophy. And then as senior raters, you need to develop a senior rater philosophy, and you need to share that with your members that you have the responsibility and obligation to senior rate. You should not, as an individual, find out that your senior rater doesn't have room in their profile when it's time to come in and sign your evaluation, and you find out that you didn't get the block check that you thought about, that you thought you had deserved, and not understanding when you should get it. And one bit of advice that I would give the non-commissioned officer corps out there is, as we talk about effective writing for evaluations, there's something that we have to do that's not normally in our wheelhouse. Typically, we train officers. You look at, the young sergeant first class that's training a platoon leader on how to be a leader in that organization, and so on and so forth. And that continues to develop throughout our Corps. So something that I would say that is not common for the NCO Corps is, in this case, is when we talk about writing and we talk about senior rater philosophies and senior rater profiles, as a non-commissioned officer, you need to reach out to the officer, and you need the officer to teach you. And again, this is something that we're not typically used to. It's usually us teaching the officers. But in this case, you need to look out and seek out those former battalion commanders, those former NCOs, those former brigade commanders who have, over the years, have developed a senior rater philosophy. The officer corps has been going through a constrained profile for many years, so they understand this. For the NCO Corps, we're 3 or 4 years into this new evaluation system, and for some of us, especially our junior NCOs, if we're not developing them early on, they're not getting a true understanding of our current evaluation system and what that looks like. So one of the things that we have to do as a rater, as a senior rater, and even as the individual that is being rated is we have to look beyond the 5-meter target. We have to look, 300 meters out as it relates to evaluation process. And I say that because you have to look at things like, what is the current through date of the individual that you have? How long are you going to have that individual in your section? What is the duration that individual is going to serve? What is the time requirement for their KD completion in accordance with the DAPAM 600-25? What does their career map say that they should be doing at that grade plate or at the next grade plate? These are critical things that you need to understand because that all comes down to timing of when you give that heartbeat or when you don't, if they've achieved the expectations that you've laid out in that counseling. You need to understand when is your soldier eligible for promotion and selection boards. If they are a top block, they are the most qualified individual. Do I give them that top block that they've earned? Do I give that to them now? And then it's their first look, or they're not even eligible for the next rank. And then mathematically speaking, you figured out how many more evaluations you're going to have to render, and then you realize that, well, I won't even be able to give them that most qualified block when they need it the most right before the board because maybe they're only going to be serving with you for another 6 months. So there is a methodical, mathematical analysis that a senior rater has to look at, and this is why it's absolutely critical that counseling occurs. And so a non-commissioned officer, you are responsible just as much as that rater and that senior rater to demand that counseling. That counseling is a right that each of us have, and it's an obligation that our raters and our senior raters owe to us. So if you're not being properly counseled, sitting back and doing nothing is not the answer. You need to actively engage on that as well. And I would offer up, if that's not going in the direction that it should, then you should use your injects through the NCO support channel to help facilitate that. Another thing to look at is complete the record dates, and those change by every evaluation board that comes up. So it's critical that you understand MILPER messages, that you read MILPER messages, that you understand that hypothetically, let's say if a board convenes in August, that doesn't, the evaluation is not going to cut off in August. HRC is going to impose a backwards planning model that's probably going to have that evaluation needing to be closed out anywhere from 60 to 90 days prior to that board convening date. So again, mathematically, will you be able to render a complete the record evaluation? Another thing for the individual soldier to understand is that, a complete the record report, if you're eligible to receive a complete the record, because there are requirements for that, it's an optional report. It is absolutely not required. And sometimes, if you're having that dialogue with your rater and your senior rater, you may not want to have that complete the record evaluation. And so that's a dialogue and a discussion that you should have with your rater and senior rater. But it is absolutely, it's an optional report. It's not a required report. And you got to monitor when reports are required. They got to be submitted on time. You need to have unit rating schemes established, and they need to be accurate. That is a leader's responsibility. And all of that goes into understanding the basic roles and principles of a senior rater. How do we assess our NCOs? And so I would offer up to you is, if you look at this GTA card that's been created, this is a great card that you can carry around in your pocket, that you can have as you go out to training events. You should have it as you sit down and do your counselings. And it's something that you can find very easily in the ADP 6-22, and it helps you assess the competencies and the attributes of a non-commissioned officer. And you can quickly go through, and I'm not going to explain how to fill out the little block checks here. It's pretty self-explanatory, but you can, based off of each area, you can determine whether they exceed, whether they're proficient, are they capable, are they unsatisfactory, or was it not observed? Because not everything is going to be observed during that necessarily that time that you do your assessment. But if this is something that you have in your your toolkit and your smart book, as you walk around, as you engage with those leaders, with those soldiers that you either rate or senior rate, it's a very helpful tool that you can have, that you can jot notes down on, and then you can go back to that support form and kind of fill things in. It also brings credibility when you sit down with the individual and you're able to pull out this card and show that, hey, on this day during this training event, I assessed you on your ability to lead others, build trust within the squad, and so on and so forth. And here's where I feel that you need adjustment, or here's where I feel like you were meeting the commander's intent, my intent as your rater or senior rater, and you're able to provide that direct feedback to the non-commissioned officer. With that, we're going to move on to understanding the block checks. I think some of us old school, tend to forget, the reason the Army moved to this system that we are in today is to ensure that we don't do picket fences anymore, justified left, everyone's an excellence, everybody's a 1-1. So you have to understand, what those block checks mean. And if you take the old NCOER and you laid it on top of the new one, your exceed the standard is essentially our old excellence, and the far exceeded is like your excellence on steroids. And I offer up to people, as it explains right here, and I'll just read this for you. For the far exceeded standard, it's a rated NCO performs extraordinarily above the required Army standard and organizational goals of leader competencies and attributes. Leadership enables soldiers and units to far surpass required organizational and Army standards. Demonstrated performance epitomizes excellence in all aspects. This NCO and his or her soldiers consistently take disciplined initiative in applying leader competencies and attributes. Results have an immediate impact and enduring effect on the mission, their soldiers, the unit, and the Army. And it's demonstrated by the best of the upper 1/3 of NCOs in the same grade. So as you look at this slide and you look at each standard block check there, we've highlighted some words for you to really think about. And one thing that I try to explain to individuals, the difference between a far exceeded and an exceeded standard. So a far exceeded is our water walkers, right? We have our water walkers. They run, they sprint across the water, and the water never touches them. They are the Olympic swimmers. So if you look at Michael Phelps is a perfect example of a far exceeded standard. So Michael Phelps goes out and he swims the 200 medley, and he gets the gold medal. He's a far exceeded standard. The individual that's 1/100th of a second behind Michael Phelps is a great athlete. He is a great swimmer. He's a great individual, but there can only be one. There can only be one far exceeded the standard. And so he or she exceeds the standard. They're an excellence because that far exceeded is reserved for that upper 1/3. And so your responsibility as a rater and your responsibility as a senior rater is to define those things that are achievable to meet that mark of, and those again are dialogues that you should be having as you're doing your counselings and demonstrating. It has to be a fair and achievable standard for all. It can't be something that is only found in a particular MOS, and you're rating a non-combat arms individual. You can't apply a combat arms standard that is required for combat arms soldiers and then say that standard needs to be upheld to a support MOS. So it has to be general standards that all soldiers have the ability to achieve. Whether they achieve it or not, that's a completely different discussion and topic, but they have to have the ability to do that. So again, this is kind of what I was explaining before. If you kind of look at this diagram here, and the red dots kind of in the exceed standards, met standards, and did not meet. That was essentially our old evaluation system of the excellence, qualified, needs improvement, and so on and so forth. And so as you read and you look through these areas, you need to understand what each one of those block checks mean. And then those block checks, as we get here in a minute into the bullet comments, they have to, you have to be able to draw the line to one another. So that block check has to meet what those comments are saying, and vice versa. The comments, you can't put generic comments in there and then put a far exceeded. Because the board, believe it or not, they do take the time. They have plenty of time to read as they're going through, and they have the ability to see through just a block check that was thrown out there versus a block check that is quantifiable and is supported. The other thing I'd like to highlight, down on the rater overall performance is at the bottom there, as it clearly says, it's representing the NCO's overall performance compared to others in the same grade whom you have rated in your career, right? And then you have to put the number that you currently rate in your current position. That, the bottom block there in J comments, that is not an area for, hey, I forgot to say something above and I want to say it down below. This block is, exclusive to talking about the NCO's overall performance and then comparing them to other non-commissioned officers that you've had throughout your career. And as a rater, when we get into, as we talk again about strong narratives and inclusive narratives, if that NCO, if that non-commissioned officer, you're going to far exceed them, it would behoove you to sit down and think about every non-commissioned officer that you've had, that you've assessed in your military career. Yes, there's a number that you have to put up. That demonstrates what you currently rate. That's not the same as, you don't have to use that same number below as you're stratifying. So to kind of paint that picture for you, if I'm I'm the underwater basket weaving OIC for a section, and I currently have 5 staff sergeants that work underneath me. Obviously, in that block, I'm going to put, I currently rate 5 staff sergeants. But that doesn't mean that I'm limited to expanding that scope as I stratify this particular soldier, and that I sit back and I think, okay, in my 18 years of service, I can write down by name every staff sergeant that has ever worked for me, and I come up with a number of 23, right? Now I can take that 23 and I can put wherever I feel that soldier ranks in. I can then stratify them as 3 of 23, or they are the number 1 of 23. Those have 1 of 23 is a more impactful statement than 1 of 5, and it builds to that credibility that you bring as you rate and as you're communicating. Remember, this evaluation from a rater standpoint and a senior rater standpoint is communicating to the board. It's your only ability to communicate to the board is done on the evaluation system. And so again, as you're going through the back of the NCOER, you really need to look at the NCO core competencies and attributes of be, know, and do, because those are the things that you're assessing. And that little chart there demonstrates what each of those mean and what we should be achieving as non-commissioned officers. All right, moving on to bullet comments. I think this is one of the areas that we attempt to achieve. We attempt to try to articulate best, and sometimes we don't always do the greatest job. You have to remember that as a rater and as a senior rater, your bullet comments, your senior rater narrative, this evaluation is your communication to that board or to that next level selection process that maybe an individual will be going through. So it's critical to articulate and quantify what you are saying. So just a couple things in reference to bullet comments. Bullet comments, they're mandatory regardless of the block check, the rating given. There should be at least 1 bullet comment in each block from Charlie through India. Bullet comments, they should be, as Army effective writing tells us, we should be short, concise, and to the point. Bullet comments should be no longer than 2 lines, and preferably 1 or more than 1 bullet to each line. And here's one of the keys that I think that sometimes we miss is that bullet comments, they begin with action words or verbs, action verbs being verbs, or possessive pronouns being his or her, or personal pronouns, he and she. However, oftentimes we start out with adjectives or adverbs, and often when we start a bullet comment out in that manner, if we start out with an adjective or we start out with an adverb, we've used that word and we feel, because of the use of the word, that we've already quantified the bullet comment. And oftentimes, that's why the Army wants you starting out with action words, vice adjectives or adverbs, because when you do that and when you write, you end up not quantifying the bullet, and it makes the bullet very, very generic. One of the things that I personally do as I read bullet comments, and I would offer up to each of you, is as you read a bullet comment, as you're reading it, you should be asking your question. You should be asking yourself, what did the service member do? What was the impact achieved? And was it positive or negative? If you can't answer those 3 questions while you're reading that bullet comment, it's 99% sure that bullet comment does not match the block check that was given, or that bullet comment is very generic, and I could take that bullet comment and apply it from Sergeant Brown to Sergeant Schmuckatelli to Sergeant Cherry. And bullet comments should not be that way. They should be exclusive to that rated individual, and they shouldn't be interchangeable in between NCOs. Obviously, basic rules, they have to be double spaced between, they proceed with a small o, and then it starts, it starts with a lowercase letter unless it's a proper noun that is, at the beginning that starts the bullet comment out. And then again, as I said a minute ago, the block check should support, should be supported by the rating officials. Use a specific example. Moving on. Therefore, a rater must decide under which attribute and competencies the bullet fits best. So as you're writing, you need to figure out where does that bullet comment, where does that achievement fit best as I'm assessing the NCO and I'm talking about the NCO. So I shouldn't be talking about how the NCO's presence is X, Y, and Z, and I'm talking then about that in their achieves block, if that makes sense. And moving on, and so if you look at these next two or three slides, these are just action words that are out there to help you as a writer as you begin writing those bullet comments and thinking of how you want to start out, whichever achievement or whichever attribute competency you're attempting to address. And these are broken down into different categories. So you have your management, leadership skills. There's a bunch of action words, verbs that you can utilize. If you look at the communication and people skills and how those relate to the areas that you're assessing, there's a group of different words there that you can use as action words. Same with the research and skills. You have your technical skills, you have your teaching skills, and then just general data, financial skills. So maybe things that they're improving on, things that they've built, so on and so forth to help maybe in a particular area. Again, these are just action words that are out there. There's millions of action words that everybody can Google and figure out. These are just provided as an opportunity to understand. The other thing that I will tell you is don't use the same verb to start out every other bullet. So a good rule of thumb is if I use an action word such as collaborated, I'm not going to use that continuously throughout the next. I'm going to use it one time on that particular area or on that evaluation, and then I'm going to choose another action word to begin the next achievement. So let's move on to the evaluation narrative. So as I talked about at the very beginning, the selection boards, they shouldn't have to guess. So what we're trying to achieve here as we're talking about effective evaluation writing is sending a clear message, spelling out, breaking it down for Barney level for that board, what your recommendation is as a leader in the United States Army on that soldier's performance and their potential to assume the next higher grade or unfortunately maybe to stay at their current grade that they're in. It should not be ambiguous for the board. The board should not have to figure out and read in between the lines. One thing that you have to watch for is that raters must focus on the quantifying and qualifying performance of that evaluation of that non-commissioned officer. Raters do not get to speak or to address anything in reference to a soldier's performance. Senior raters, they need to amplify their potential block checks by using the narrative to clearly convey the appropriate message to selection boards. And a senior rater has the ability to speak both about performance and potential. but should focus a lot on the potential. And they get to their potential based off of their performances as well. As we talk about, quantifying and qualifying, you should talk about, the passion that the senior rater has for the rated soldier's performance. And you do that, as we were talking earlier in reference to the rater, is writing exclusive narratives. As it says right here, they should clearly describe superior performance and their potential. They are one of XX, or they are my best X, Y, and Z. They're in the top 5%. It can't. Another thing is that senior raters can't get outside of their scope. They can't say that Sergeant Schmuckatelli is the best 42 Alpha in the United States Army, right? Because a senior rater, there's no senior rater out there that knows every single soldier at that grade plate in the Army. So you can't open that aperture so wide that it becomes fluff and it falls upon deaf ears at the board. Strong narratives, they have to describe significant performance, and again, enthusiastically recommending promotion, outstanding promotion, outstanding performance, one of the best, promote today, immediately, before the sun comes up. And then the most important thing is when you as a senior rater make those comments, you need to articulate to the board why they should immediately do what you've just told them to do. And you do that by highlighting the attributes and the competencies that separate them from their peers. So just saying, promote Sergeant Brown immediately to Master Sergeant. Okay, why? Why should Sergeant First Class Brown be promoted to Master Sergeant? What attributes and competencies are they displaying every single day that set them apart and make them the number one of whatever you've stratified them on? The other thing that the senior raters have to do as you talk about stratification is, hey, if you use that stratification, rule of thumb is it's burned, and you don't use the same stratification within a year, and you definitely don't use it. You don't use it within the same CMF. So you can get creative if you happen to be in a joint environment. You can get creative. Maybe you only senior rate 3 Army Sergeant First Classes, but you have 10 E7s between the other sister services. So you can, instead of saying that a soldier is one of 3, you could say a soldier is one of 7 sergeant, or one of 7 E7s in this joint environment. It's different ways to look at expanding how you articulate and you define who truly is the best and the best. So you got to be careful with your narrative, as we said earlier. What is said, what is not said, has the same impact as what is said. Don't say the same thing to all the people. Boards can easily detect repeat verbiage. Avoid using the same verbiage on a soldier from year to year. As a battalion sergeant major, I look at every single evaluation for non-commissioned officers that come through. And so oftentimes this is something I see where, last year we said Sergeant Schmuckatelli was the best underwater basket weaving NCOIC, and then, the next year he's still kicking butt, he's still the best, and we say that same comment again. You have to change it up. It shows the board that it brings more credibility to those comments when you do those things and when you change them up, rather than it being a cookie cutter approach. It should never be, an evaluation should never be a cookie cutter approach. As a senior rater, you can't mention block checks. You can't use board language. You can't say, this is a 6+ soldier. You can't say things like, well, if my profile supported, I would make this soldier would get my MQ. Those are prohibited comments that as a senior rater, you can't use those. So moving on to senior rater consistency. Again, senior raters need to amplify the block checks by using a narrative that's clear, sends the appropriate message to selection boards. The following classification types of narratives, they serve as a guide. They're not 100%, but exclusive narratives are those that clearly describe superior performance, and the potential is above the vast majority. The majority of evaluations, the preponderance on the NCO side of the house, the preponderance of evaluations are going to be highly qualified. A senior rater is constrained to no more than 24% of a most qualified in a particular grade plate for their life. So when they retire and they become a DA civilian, they still carry on that exact same profile they had as a green suitor. So maintaining at 24% is a very tight shot group, and so the preponderance of NCOs should fall into the highly qualified arena. And the most qualified should really be reserved for those that are truly the best of the best. Again, the most qualified should be utilized with those that have a mature profile. As you get in and understand a rater's, senior rater's profile, when they render, they can, anytime they're rendering their first report, their first of 4 reports, one can be a most qualified with regardless of their profile. However, mathematically speaking, that will require them to then render approximately 7 more highly qualified or below reports until they will be able to render that next most qualified. So again, it goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, that as a senior rater, you have to understand, when is that soldier in the zone for their selection? How many reports am I going to have to render them? How long, will they be in this position, or maybe how long do they need remaining to be KD complete? Because you may have soldiers that come to you, hypothetically, that already have 18 months of KD time, and they're with you potentially because they're only going to get another 6 to 12 months, depending on what their CMF says is KD time. So again, it's understanding that and understanding to when you should fire that silver bullet, if you have that silver bullet, and most importantly, has that service member achieved those things that you've laid out to get the most qualified. Because it shouldn't just be a given. Just because a senior rater has the ability to render a most qualified doesn't mean that they should. Again, the soldier should be absolutely deserving of it, and they should have demonstrated they are truly the best of the best. So moving on to, we've talked about quite a bit about exclusive narratives. Let's talk about strong narratives. Strong narratives are those that describe significant performance accomplishment. Strong narratives are great, are still good evaluations. They should be soldiers that are moving, have upward ability. They're moving towards the top. It should address, appropriate military schoolings. It should talk about, these are the ones that are in the top third, and definitely, we want these soldiers to be promoted, so they have a strong potential for promotion. So if someone is not deserving of promotion, not deserving to move on to that next role and responsibility, then they probably shouldn't be getting a strong narrative with a highly qualified block check, if that makes sense. Enumeration is a technique that is used to rank order soldiers in a particular grade plate, based again upon their demonstrated performance or their potential. And enumeration is typically utilized in exclusive narratives. And so depending on the mathematical problem, so what I'm getting at is I wouldn't enumerate and that numerate equate to 50%, or that enumeration equate to 33%. Really you're enumerating kind of 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 and 5, depending on how big the individuals that you're rating, that pile that you're rating them against. But if you only have 6 soldiers, it's not necessary to write he or she is 5 of 6 or 6 of 6, unless that's the message that you're trying to send to the board. And if that's the case, then you're more than likely not block checking a highly qualified, or as a rater, you're not checking exceeded standards. So, all right, continuing on to raters consistency. The best rater and senior rater narratives, they're short. They tell a simple story about the quality of a soldier being evaluated. And again, they focus on, their 3 to 5 years potential out. Tie, as senior raters, tie the potential in to where you talk about down at the evaluation about successive positions. So, if my number one successive position is being a first sergeant, then up in the top in your senior rater comments, as you're talking about, I should be promoted to the rank of master sergeant, then equate that to what I should do next in my job as well, and then use my attributes and competencies to quantify that. So why, making the statement of, this service member, this NCO, promote this soldier immediately today to master sergeant, and reassign him or her to a first sergeant position immediately due to his or hers demonstrated ability to lead, and tie that into their attributes and competencies that set them apart from their peers, if that makes sense. But the board sees that, tie those two in there. There's a reason why we write successive assignments and then that broadening assignment on there, because again, not only is this evaluation being used at the evaluation boards for promotion, but they're also being used as a talent management tool for future assignments. Again, quantify the rated soldier's value, to their peers, and again, do that in concert with the senior rater block check. So, the audio has got to match the video and vice versa. So the bullet comments have to match the block check, and the block check has to match the comments as well. Many narratives are initially inconsistent. Quantifying, top 2% of my sergeant first classes, when you have a small population, that doesn't lead to credibility. Stating the best ever, when there's only 3 in the population and a highly qualified label, you just told the board that, I really haven't had a large pool that I've assessed, or, saying the best ever and I'm a second lieutenant, in the United States Army, you've probably only rated, this one individual. So, avoid things like that. Avoid phrases and cliches. They're counterproductive, and they're overutilized. So unlimited potential, hit the ground running, consummate professional, stellar, so on and so forth. Those have been used so many times over and over again. And so again, as you make statements, I tell you to go back and look at ADP 6-22 and look at those attributes and competencies that a non-commissioned officer is supposed to be, know, and do. and tie those statements into that and articulate how they are achieving above that standard that we expect. Don't exaggerate, saying things like you're rating a sergeant first class and saying, a future sergeant major will, be the best brigade CSM. We don't even know if they're going to be a successful sergeant first class, much let alone we don't even know if they're going to be a successful master sergeant. A lot can change between the time that when they do their master sergeant time and their first sergeant time, and they may never achieve that. So don't open that aperture so wide that it falls on deaf ears because it becomes a narrative gimmick, or that it becomes something that's not impactful because you went beyond. Saying you're rating a sergeant first class and saying promote him to sergeant major today. You may be sitting there laughing and thinking, why would you say those things? Why is the sergeant major even talking about it? Well, it's because people do say that. And you're skipping the fact that they haven't even been a master sergeant yet. So, don't use that. Don't use things like, if I could prove it, blank is, they're a master sergeant in disguise, and they're really a staff sergeant. Again, those things the board can read through that, and they see those as narrative gimmicks, and they don't bring credibility to what you're talking about in reference to that soldier. And ultimately, it ends up hurting the soldier. The soldier may feel great that you made those comments. They may walk away from their senior rater counseling or their time to sign their eval and think, man, I just got the best evaluation ever. And in fact, when it comes to the board's just sitting back and they're disregarding those comments, because you're being frivolous in your comments. So don't use those. So here's moving on to some exclusive examples. Below there's 3 good narratives that have been written that are just some examples of strong exclusive narratives. One for command sergeant majors, one for sergeant majors, and then one for first sergeants. And obviously you can take a little bit from each of these and pull away, but these are clear examples of what an exclusive narrative should look like, and then again how they relate back to the outstanding performance and the block check that individual is achieving. The next slide is going to show you there's some strong examples of strong narratives that are out there. Again, showing these are narratives that are strong, and they still remain highly competitive for promotion, and truly set those soldiers up for success as they board for that next higher rank. All right, so let's move on to the next slide, which is to understand the block checks of the senior rater. And so what I would tell you is to sit through here and read each one of these. Understand, as we've highlighted at the bottom of each, there's certain comments that are made in each definition. And so for the most qualified, they have the strongest for potential and selection at the earliest opportunity of head of peers. So your most qualified, if things are going right, that's who you're telling the board that needs to be promoted tomorrow. So when you're looking at that soldier, when you're assessing that soldier, you need to think, if I was to remove that soldier's rank today and put on the next rank, do they have the potential? Does their performance support being able to serve at that next higher grade immediately? And are they truly the best of the best that you're assessing? And if they are, then that's who you're trying to define as your most qualified. For those that, your block check is a highly qualified, those are people that have a strong potential for promotion. They're highly competitive for promotion. But again, notice that we're not talking about necessarily them being promoted ahead of their peers. They may end up being promoted ahead of their peers, but it's a strong validation for promotion. When you're talking about your qualified population, that means they're fully capable. They're capable to serve at the next higher rank, but that's if promotions are required. And so one thing that we often forget is that requirements drive promotions, right? And so if there's enough requirements out there in the Army's inventory, then the Army will reach down to those qualified soldiers and promote them to the next higher grade. And then obviously, it goes without being said, but the not qualified are those soldiers that are not recommended for promotion and those that should be considered for separation. So those are usually the easiest to figure out. Where I would say that we probably struggle as a Corps is understanding the difference between the most qualified and the highly qualified, and what is that true separation. Again, the most qualified should be reserved for that top upper 1/3. Only 24% or less are going to get the most qualified, and every soldier should be achieving and striving for that highly qualified. Moving on to what board members are saying, as I talked about at the very beginning, your evaluation speaks to the board, and the boards are telling us this. The senior-raters, they're an invaluable, and they have the most influence in how the board judges an individual soldier's performance. You got to think you are that L&O to the board. You are explaining to that board, by how you are writing, you're telling the board, you're representing that soldier at the board of why they should be selected or why they shouldn't be. It's imperative that raters and senior-raters, again, use clear, quantifiable descriptions in their comments. Don't leave it ambiguous for the board. The Army's, encouraging and imposing discipline on senior-rater narratives. Inflative narratives are going to dilute a clear message of superior performance conveyed by the most qualified report in the future. So again, if that service member hasn't achieved a most qualified, a senior-rater shouldn't render the most qualified report just because they have it. And don't render a most qualified block check and then have a narrative that is written that is, at the fully qualified or highly qualified or qualified level, because that again sends a conflicting message to the board. Those senior-raters that clearly defined not only soldiers with great potential and performance, but also substantiated performance, that articulated those that had substandard performance or soldiers possessing limited potential and poor performance, greatly enhanced the process. So, as a senior-rater, you have the moral obligation to look that individual in the eye through your counseling and letting them know they're not meeting mustard. And then when it comes time for the evaluation, you need to render the evaluation that they earned. Not the one that's going to make them feel better, but you need to be able to have the intestinal fortitude to look that individual in the eye and explain why their performance, why their potential does not meet the standards for the next higher grade, or maybe even the current grade that you're rating them on. And then promotion potential recommendations, they didn't always match the future duty assignment recommendations. And again, it goes back to, the comment I was just making on the lack of candid mentoring. So, as you're talking about, it's why I made the comment that you need to tie your comments into those successive assignments that individual may or may not have the ability to achieve later in their career. That, in effect, is some highlighted points on how to effectively write evaluations and why the evaluation process is so important as we move forward and as raters and senior raters, as we tell the story to future promotion and selection boards. All right, hey, I appreciate everybody tuning in today's LPD in reference to evaluation effective writing and in reference to the centralized evaluation process. I truly hope that each and every one of you got something out of the presentations today. This is something critical that as leaders, as non-commissioned officers, that we need to understand. This environment is changing daily, and so it is critical that we stay knowledgeable and please disseminate this information throughout your footprints and throughout your areas of influence, your sphere of influence as non-commissioned officers, because iron sharpens iron, and together we will collectively get better, and it will permeate at all echelons. With that, I thank you for your time, and climb to glory.